We're about ready to celebrate Purim in total. Of course, you might know today is Tanit Esther, the fast of Esther. In the Megillah, Esther fasts for 3 days and actually asked the entire Jewish people to fast for 3 days in order to seek favor from God, to approach King Achashverosh and to have his mercy to allow her to appear before him, to then petition and ask for his help in saving the Jewish people. And Esther declared a national 3-day fast. So we fast 1 day. I guess we wanted to make it a little faster. And then we'll celebrate tonight. So today we're going to study about Purim a little bit, and wanted to talk specifically through 2 questions. So the 2 questions I wanted to address and talk through is, number 1 is, who is missing in the Megillah text?
God.
Yes, God's name, no name of God. No mention of God is ever included in our text of Megillah Esther, our book of Esther. Very interesting that a entire book in the Bible, one of the books in the Tanakh does not mention God. So, by the way, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the only book of the Bible that doesn't exist. The archaeologists and scholars have uncovered at least a section, a piece of every other book from the Bible except the book of Esther. It's interesting, right? Because that's one book where God isn't mentioned. So we do know, we sort of get God into the story. And in fact, we say that Esther's name is a hint, because Esther is related to the word Hester Panim, or the phrase Hester Panim, which means hidden face. Am I doing okay, Ruth? So Esther's name can mean hidden, and there's an idea that God is hidden in the story of Esther. So we're actually going to give a counter later in our class. So that's the one question we're going to ask or try to address today in class. And the second question is, why didn't Mordechai bow before Haman? Why didn't he bow before Haman? If you know the classic story, and if you know the actual text of our Megillah, what is the reason given that he doesn't bow, if you know? And I can pull it up and show you if you want. Anyone know the reason why? Off the top of your head?
Because Jews don't bow to anybody except God.
Because Jews don't bow to anybody except. Is that actually what it says?
Which is halakhically incorrect, because you are allowed to bow down to other people. But the midrash is that Haman was wearing an idol on his clothing.
There you go. Yeah, let's just pull it up so that everybody sees, so that we're on the same page. Let me find Sepharia. It's Esther 3:2, if my memory is correct. My computer's slow today.
It's in the part that I'm reading.
Here we go. Sometimes afterward, we're at the beginning of chapter 3, King Achashverosh promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He advanced him and seated him higher than any of his fellow officials. All the king's courtiers in the palace gate knelt and bowed low to Haman, for such was the king's order concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel or bow low. Then the king's courtiers who were in the palace gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's order?" When they spoke to him that day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's resolve would prevail, for he explained to them he was a Jew. So what's the reason?
He's Jewish.
He's Jewish, okay, but as you heard, Right? What did you say, Ron?
I said there's no halakhic reason for a person not to bow down to another person. I mean, it goes back all the way to Abraham. You see it happening.
Yeah. Who does Abraham bow to?
I think it was Abimelech. I don't remember.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Who else bows in the Tanakh?
Moshe, לפני
Moshe.
הסנה.
Okay. All right. Before the burning bush. All right. And anybody, does Jacob ever bow? Does he bow before Esau?
I think he actually bows before Joseph eventually.
Mm-hmm. Right. And go down the list, right? Like, I always say, like, well, when I did Taekwondo for a number of years, I'd always bow and bow, before the person I was sparring against, and you bow to when you enter the room where you do it, the dojo, we oftentimes Jews bow, so, right. So, this is this larger question. Why does it say, that you're not going to bow? And, I'll give you the famous joke that, this joke it was from Rabbi Sachs actually said it, a blessed memory. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, when he was knighted by the queen. You know the story? And I'll say it again because I love Rabbi Sachs, right? That that he wouldn't bow, right? So they actually had a little I think this is apocrypha, and he told the story, but they built a little thing because he wouldn't bow, because Jews don't bow. So he built like a little ramp that when he went for his knighting ceremony, so that the queen could, get higher. Usually she just, somebody stands before the queen, and they bow, and she knights them. But they had this little, step stool thing.
This isn't the joke where why is this night different from
Of
others?
course it is. You took my punchline.
What other joke is there?
Punchline. Yes, yes, yes. So she walks in and she sees this thing and she says, yeah, why is this night different than any other nights? You got it. Thanks, Ron. Okay, enough about that. Okay, so, right, classically we say, the Megillah tells us, right, he didn't bow before Haman because he was a Jew. And Jews don't bow before anyone else, right? Only before, again, it doesn't, remember, God's name isn't mentioned here, so it doesn't say that Jews only bow to God, right? We read that in because God's name is never mentioned, right? Well, that's what we always say. Is this true? Right? Ron is already presenting the Midrash, right? There's a Midrash that says that Haman wore an idol. He either wore like something on his neck, on a necklace. He wore some, idolatrous thing. It was embroidered on his shirt and his hat, and that it would look like then Mordechai was worshiping an idol. And is that forbidden? To bow before an idol? Right, that is obviously forbidden, right? Jews don't do that. So that would make a lot of sense, but that's not anywhere. That is a midrash. The rabbis are trying to figure it out and figure out what happens. I'll give you another potential possibility, and this is from an article on the Torah. TheTorah.com. Have you ever studied them? So I'll show it to you for a second. The great resource, TheTorah.com. Why did Mordechai not bow to Haman? Can you see it there? Right, here's your picture. Right, it's called Mordechai's Risky Defiance. By the way, the interesting thing is that I think is it in this one too? If you look in the Hebrew of that verse that we said, Mordechai lo yichra velo yishtachaveh. Ruth, how would you translate lo Ra velo yishtachaveh.
Ich rise, bend your knees, something like that.
Mm-hmm. By the way, this is a phrase we're familiar with. Aleinu, va'anachnu korim u'mishtachavim. It's the same phrase, right?
Yeah.
So the question is this just kneeling and bowing, or does this word yishtachaveh talk more about like pray, worship? Is it more than just, is this a physical thing? Like I gotta bend, and then you know how like when we bend, we first bend our knees and then we lower our bodies. You know, we put our heads down. So is this just talking about the two-step physical process we have of bowing, or is the second phrase more focused on not just physically bowing, but actually,
But only mentally praying,
lowering yourself, worshiping. Yeah. So this is the next question, that even though, right, the translation here doesn't say, it just talks about bowing. Maybe this says Mordechai would not worship him, right? Because in many cultures, the king, and remember, Haman was the stand-in for the king is worshipped as God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? The king is somehow elevated more than just, it's more than just a human being. The king has some level of divinity, and the king's representative has some level of divinity. Yeah,
like
Ruth?
Paro was the god.
Yeah, like Paro, sun god. Yeah. Pharaoh was divinity. Yeah, Ruth?
Has it anything to do with Haman being on a pedestal? Because they make a point of Hashverosh put him on a pedestal, and then everybody bowed and worship.
That's a good question. So physically standing on a pedestal.
Yeah.
It could be. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, sort of like I'm also picturing, how like the royalty was carried on a litter, on that bed right around, and they were raised and everyone had to lower themselves. Yeah, it could be. It could be. So here's another example,
Before you go on, if you look at the
Yeah.
beginning of that verse you were showing us a second ago, the actual words Chorim Umishtakavim are there come first, right? That is the same word.
Yeah,
Early
and
in
it's
the
a
verse.
phrase. It's a phrase that we use. Yes.
Yep. Okay.
It's a phrase that we use in other places. In fact, even in the Torah reading this morning for fast days, Moses, I read this morning in Minyan, right? Moses does this word, and Yishtachaveh is there, right? And the question is, does it really just mean lowering yourself, or is there some level of prayer involved here?
So some of the translations say prostrate, and when you go to prostrate, I would say that's part of worship.
Yeah. Well, here's the question. If you are begging forgiveness, again, obviously this wasn't Haman isn't begging forgiveness here, but right, if you're I'm thinking about groveling, maybe, if you're groveling, if you're like really want somebody, you're submitting yourself to them, right? On some level, it becomes almost prayerful.
But can I say something? During those years, the king was almost like a representative of God. And in a lot of places, like we take an example from the movies, The King and I. So nobody could stand in the same level as the king. So if the king was sitting, everybody had to kneel on the floor. So that's maybe one of the things also.
Could be, yeah. So we just read on Shabbat, it was Parshat Zachor, Shabbat Zachor. We read about the command to blot out the memory of Amalek, correct? Is that a yes? Yes.
That's a yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
was my
there's also Yeah, so there's also a question. If you're supposed to blot out the memory of Amalek and you're a Jew, and you know that Haman is an Amalekite, is there a problem with showing deference and honor to an Amalekite? And would you perhaps not bow specifically to him, to an Amalekite, but you would bow to other members of the royal party? That's what this article suggests as another potential reason here, which I thought was interesting, right? You know, if this is sort of your arch enemy that the Torah says you can never provide any honor to, what do you think?
Maybe.
Maybe. You didn't sound that excited about it.
No, it's possible.
Right? Are there people who you would just never afford any respect to?
Yes, people
Yes.
disown their respect. You just don't respect everybody. I respect people who show respect and who have the same values as I do. I will not respect somebody who is trying to cheat me or to cheat someone else or to forcefully beat somebody. So there is a level of respect.
Mm-hmm. So that's this question that this article is bringing up. Like, does Haman embody all the, none of the values that we respect, and therefore Mordecai was right, and it wasn't necessarily the whole not bowing before God, or only bow to God, but it was specifically about Haman, about the values that Haman lived by and transmitted and would rule the people, and the lineage that he carried on. It's an interesting question because, some people might question some leaders, and some leaders in the world, and it's a question of providing, when do we provide respect? Do we provide respect unconditionally or not? Right? All right. Any other thoughts on this? And I wanted to shift to more some of the God stuff.
Well, since you quoted the part of blotting out the memory, how do we remember and blot out at the same time?
It's a great question. I'll tell you how. Right, because it sort of sounds like it sort of sounds like an impossible task to remember and to remove, correct?
Is it an oxymoron?
Yeah, it's sort of like an oxymoron. Yeah, so the way that you remember and forget Haman is that when the Megillah is read, you do have to hear Haman's name. As soon as you hear Haman's name, what do?
You make noise.
Then you make noise. Yeah, because traditionally you have to hear every single word of the Megillah to fulfill your obligation, including Haman's name. So we remember it by hearing it and then making the noise. I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's what I always think about. Right?
Makes sense. Yeah.
Right. So, and in my way, here's like the rabbi spin on it is anytime a name that has brought harm and evil in this world, we must remember that name so that that the legacy never carries on.
That's why we say Yimach Shmo v'Zichro, like for Hitler and.
Yeah. So right, for those non-Hebrew speakers like Ruth, I'm joking. Well, I don't know where Ruth went. Oh, there you are. Right. So what Helena said is oftentimes when we make mention of sort of, and the enemies of the Jews, horrible, whatever, we say this phrase, Yimach Shemo, may their name be blotted out. And sometimes, oftentimes when we mention the Nazis, we'll say Yimach Shmam, right? That may we forget their name, may their memory be blotted out, right? We have to remember, we can never forget the atrocities that they brought on, but we don't carry on their legacy. Okay, let's be a little happier. Is that okay?
Please.
Today is supposed to be a happy day. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So, where is God in the book of Esther? So I'm going to pause it, and I've thought about this in other years. I'm going to not just pause it, but and I'm not just going to suggest, but God is involved. So I'll show you a couple of places. The first is in our classic Midrash. We have angels at work in the story. I'm not sure if you know that. Do you know that? Angels are at work. In fact, angels are at work specifically today. I have to find, I got a lot of things open. Specifically today. So if you can see my screen, today is the third day. This is the third day of Esther's fast, leading into the actual when the saving happened, which is tonight, and that's why we're going to read the Megillah tonight and celebrate Purim. Lynn, you want to read?
Sure.
You unmuted yourself.
Oh, am I muted?
No, you
No,
unmuted yourself.
Oh, I
Yeah.
did. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah,
You're
but I can
good.
read.
Read for me.
Where it starts now.
Mm-hmm.
Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the entrance of the house.
Okay. God is right there. Don't you see God? Does anyone see God in this verse?
I read someplace when the Megillah refers to the king, or king without the in front of it, that's Ahasuerus. But when he says the king, that can be interpreted to be God.
So right, that's one of these interpretations, right? There's a difference between king and the king, right? So the king perhaps is God. Yeah, and Eric, yeah, that does carry through. That wasn't what I was going to say, but that is an interpretation. So, and that actually this following me, there's a midrash from the Talmud right here, right? And she stood in the inner court of the king's house, right? And it says, at that point, you want to read it, Lynn? You unmuted
Sure.
yours. Go for it.
And she stood in the inner court of the king's house, Rav Levi said. When she reached the chamber of the idols, the divine presence left her. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Maybe you punish the inadvertent sin like the intentional one, or one done under compulsion like one done willingly? Or is it because I called him dog, as it says? Deliver my soul from the sword, mine only from the power of the dog. She straightway retracted and called him lion, as it says, save me from the lion's mouth.
Okay, so it's really hard to understand what's happening here, except I'll tell you what's happening here, which is, now I'll show you, there is one of the 150 books in the book of Psalms, the Psalms that are attributed to King David. Psalm 22 has these verses, which you can see on the screen. This is verse 2, and then jumping to 21 and 22. The rabbis often look to stories in the Bible where they sort of see the Psalms coming into action, or perhaps they say the Psalm was originally written by one of our biblical heroes, and they find a moment in their life that sort of connects to the theme of the Psalm. We say the 150 Psalms were written by King David, but then they say Jacob wrote one, and Moses wrote one, and Korach's sons wrote a few, and right, there are different ones attributed to different people. So the rabbis read this Psalm into Esther at the moment she was about to approach Ahasuerus to ask him to save her people. So if you just read the verses here, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And art from my help at the words of my cry, deliver my soul from the sword. Remember, because she was going to walk up and she would either get the golden scepter or she would get killed. Mine only from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of wild oxen. Do answer me. So if you just read these verses, would you think that this is written for Queen Esther approaching Ahasuerus to ask for help? To risk her life, to stand up to save the Jewish people? Can I answer no for everyone? Would you agree?
Yes, you can say no.
Right, but the rabbi, the rabbis interpret, at least this one section from the Talmud, the rabbis read this into that Esther's actually saying this, or it's this conversation Esther is having. Okay, so
what about
I don't
this
know.
line? What about that line, deliver my soul from the sword? Because that may be a reference to if the king doesn't extend his scepter.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, right. So the rabbis are reading this in. But I want to show you that then this is the final thing. So the rabbis actually read in that Esther had 3 angels with her at that moment to protect her. Who else classically in the Bible supposedly had 3 angels helping them? Anyone remember? Who was visited by 3 angels?
I don't know why I want to say Daniel for some reason.
Daniel was definitely visited by angels, but we're going to go Abraham.
Abraham.
Yeah, at the beginning of, I'm so tired, of Vayera. Right? Abraham, after he circumcised himself, he's visited by the 3 angels, and each of them has a different purpose. If you remember, anyone remember what the 3 purposes were?
One was for the birth of Isaac.
Right. One was to foretell.
One was Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sarah.
One was Sodom and Gomorrah, and I can't remember the third one.
Yeah, right. One was to foretell that 99-year-old Abraham and 90-year-old Sarah were going to have a baby. Right. Number 2 was to tell Abraham about the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah to alert him, and therefore right, Abraham responds actually by challenging God. Right. And the third one was. I don't remember either, to be honest. Bikur Cholim. I mean, this is actually where we learn about Bikur Cholim, of visiting the sick. I forget what the third purpose. Maybe the third purpose was to visit the sick, because Abraham was recovering from surgery. But here we see the rabbis read into the story that 3 angels also visited Esther and helped her at this moment when she was approaching the king. Lynn, you want to read it?
Okay. The verse states, hold on a second, I got something there. The verse states, and so it was, that when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Rabbi Yohanan said, 3 ministering angels happened to join her at that time, one that raised up her neck so that she could stand erect, free of shame, one that strung a cord of divine grace around her, endowing her with charm and beauty, and one that stretched the king's scepter.
Okay. What do you take from this? This is a quote from the Talmud, right? This is a midrashic reading from Talmud, from Masechet Megillah. There's an entire book of the Talmud dedicated to the Megillah, to Purim, although it has a lot of other things in the book itself. What do you take from this little excerpt? She was protected by 3 angels at that moment when she risked her life, right, to stand up and approach the king, right? And each of the 3 angels that were with her, right, had a specific purpose. One was to stand her straight, right? So she would, I guess, a little bit more, koyach, a little bit more strength, right, to approach the king, strong and proud, right? The second was that there was some extra special beauty, charm, something really special, that was surrounding her. She was sparkling divinely, right? And the third was that, we always say, what is the reason that the king really accepted her and stretched out his scepter? Here, the rabbis are saying that, it took a little divine intervention. What do you think? Are you sold?
He could have killed her. I don't know. Somehow, when I see the first words in Hebrew, I think, is he going to use the scepter on her neck? It frightens me. Somehow, was he going to shecht her?
Yeah, I agree. Right, that the scepter could be a tool
weapon.
of violence, a weapon, right? Right, or is it
like a knife?
Favor? Yeah.
But like my mother said, there is something that protects us. So you can look at it at a different way. Always through the Holocaust, she had all kind of small things that happened to her that which was like divine providence that helped her and sheltered her from death.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the same thing happened to Esther.
Yeah, again, there's no God in the Megillah, but the rabbis read in angels, right? They read in Esther basically reciting Tehillim, reading Psalms, and reaching out to God, and God answered by sending these angels. Again, that's what the Talmud is presenting as a reading. Yeah, Bob?
I think it's interesting that the third angel is not a shield.
It's very active.
The first two apply to her appearance and to her emotion. And the third one is not applied to her. It's applied to the king.
Beautiful. Yeah. Other thoughts? Great. So what I want to shift to then is something a little bit different, if that's okay. And that is, you might know that there are variants of Megillat Esther, not in our tradition, but in other traditions. There actually are many mentions of God. In the Septuagint versions, which is the Greek version, which is the basis for the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible's version of Esther is a little different. There actually are prayers to God that Mordecai recite, and prayers to God that Esther recites. And they actually are from our tradition, but they didn't make it into our tradition. So they are very ancient. Older than our version of the Bible, but this is basically what we would consider closer to Midrash. So I'd like to share some of those with you to show how, even though our version does not include any references to God, and the rabbis, as you saw, read in Esther reciting Tehillim, that the angels are working, that there are traditions of God in the book of Esther. So I'm going to pull it up. Someone want to read some of these? Another reader?
I'll read.
Oh, thanks, Arda. Okay, let me pull it up. So I will mention that these actually were put together by Rabbi Dina Rosenberg, who you might know. She was our other rabbinic candidate, and I collected this a couple years ago. So just to show you what's called the apocryphal editions, God is mentioned over 50 times in the apocryphal edition, which is, apocryphal means this is the later version of the book of Esther, which was created by Jews later on, but it actually didn't make it into our version of the Bible, but it made it into the Christian version of the Bible. there. Esther, there's an idea that Esther keeps kosher. Have you heard this before? Esther kept kosher her entire time living as queen. And there, basically, God is the hero of the story. Whereas, the argument is sort of who is the real hero, heroine of the story, right? We always say it's miraculous and God was there sort of behind the scenes. But in this version, God is a more outright, active presence. So it starts with a dream. This is pretty much close to the opening of the apocryphal version of the Book of Esther, and there Mordecai has a dream of two dragons fighting. If you can see this, and they're roaring at every nation, a day of darkness and gloom. And the whole righteous nation was troubled. Ardai, we'll have you read in a minute when I get to the next session.
That's
Sorry.
fine.
Yeah. And they feared evils, and people cried out to God, right? And there came a great river with abundant water. Light came. The sun rose, the lowly were exalted, and devoured those held in honor. This actually frames this version of the Book of Esther, right? It opens with this dream that Mordecai has that God will respond to the cries of those who are oppressed, and God will bring through great water and light. God will raise up those who were persecuted and devour those who were the rulers at the time. Does that sort of sound like the story of Purim or Passover?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a common theme, in our holidays, right? So Mordecai saw in this dream what God had determined to do. Like literally, this is what the apocryphal version of the Book of Esther says. It's right here. Mordecai saw in this dream what God had determined to do, and after he awoke, he had his mind seeking every day to understand it. So we have later, we're going to go to page 8. I'm going to get I don't have pages here. All right, this is Mordecai's prayer. This is after Haman decrees to kill the Jewish people and the king agrees. There actually isn't a prayer. So if you'll start reading, then Mordecai prayed.
Then Mordecai prayed to the Lord, calling to remembrance all the works of the Lord. He said, O Lord, Lord, you rule as king over all things. For the universe is in your power, and there is no one who can oppose you when it is your will to save Israel. For you have made heaven and earth and every wonderful thing under heaven. You are Lord of all, and there is no one who can resist you, the Lord. You know all things. You know, O Lord, that it was not in insolence or pride or for any love of glory that I did this and refused to bow down to this proud Haman. For I would have been willing to kiss the soles of his feet to save Israel. But I did so that I might not set human glory above the glory of God. And I will not bow down to anyone but you, who are my Lord. And I will not do these things in pride. And now, O Lord God and King, God of Abraham, spare your people, for the eyes of our foes are upon us to annihilate us, and they desire to destroy the inheritance that has been yours from the beginning. Do not neglect your portion, which you redeemed for yourself out of the land of Egypt. Hear my prayer, and have mercy upon your inheritance. Turn our mourning into feasting, that we may live and sing praise to your name, O Lord. Do not destroy the lips of those who praise you. And all Israel cried out mightily, for their death was before their eyes.
Okay, thanks, Arda. Comments? Does this sound like a sort of typical traditional Jewish prayer? Comments? What do people think?
Could it be used by others in that situation? If not Esther people have had situations like this, similar over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Or
we-
Lord God, God and King. Sorry, go ahead.
We say a number of times, save us for your sake.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of what this is saying.
Yeah. Hear my prayer. Have mercy upon your inheritance means like, us. Yeah.
Us,
Turn
save
our
us.
mourning into feasting, right? These are all sort of common phrases that appear in other places. Obviously, Elohe Avraham, right? Sort of like a little bit like the beginning of our Amida. What do you think?
Won't be verbatim. Does anything like sort of this theme come up during the high holidays?
Oh yeah, 100% on Yom Kippur. Yeah. Oh yeah. 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 So this is like fairly classic Jewish prayer put in the lips of Mordecai. Now, there is nothing like this in our Megillah. I want to make sure you're aware. Like does not appear in our Megillah, the classic Megillah we have, but this is ancient, written by Jews, but never sort of made its way into our version. This is the Apocrypha. So, the rabbis actually voted. I don't know if you know, the rabbis voted what books and what versions of the books made it into the Bible. They were called the Masoretes. It was a specific select group of rabbis. And the Masoretes, this is not their version of the book of Esther. The version we have is the version. Right? This is a later version, a couple hundred years after the Bible was finished. So someone wrote this. There probably some group of Jewish writers wrote this, and I consider it like a midrash. So is this compelling to you? Does it make sense in that there's sort of perhaps like a hole in the story? Would it make sense that Mordecai would be crying out and praying to God? If you imagine the scenario, would it make sense that Mordecai sort of is like, I think about this line, I would have been willing to kiss the soles of Haman's feet in order to save the Jewish people, right? But I did so because it was necessary. I would not bow down to anyone but you, God. Thoughts? Comments?
Isn't there a part where he's described as being sackcloth and ashes for days? And it would be consistent with that mindset that he would do this then.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So this classic text also brings in a response and a prayer from Esther. So Arda, if you'll read that, and Queen Esther.
Then Queen Esther, seized with deadly anxiety, fled to the Lord. She took off her splendid apparel and put on the garments of distress and mourning. And instead of costly perfumes, she covered her head with ashes and dung, and she utterly humbled her body. Every part that she loved to adorn, she covered with her tangled hair. She prayed to the Lord God of Israel and said, "O my Lord, you only are our King. Help me, who am alone, and I have no helper but you, for my danger is in my hand. Ever since I was born, I have heard in the tribe of my family that you, O Lord, took Israel out of all the nations and our ancestors from among all their forebears for an everlasting inheritance, and that you did for them all that you promised." And now we have sinned before you, and you have handed us over to our enemies because we glorified their gods. You are righteous, O Lord, and now they are not satisfied that we are in bitter slavery, but they have covenanted with their idols to abolish what your mouth has ordained and to destroy your inheritance. Stop the mouths of those who praise you and to quench your altar and the glory of your house, to open the mouths of the nations for the praise of vain idols and to magnify forever a mortal king.
I'm going to pause you here. This is actually in the halfway point of her prayer. Have you ever imagined that Esther would give this like stirring long prayer at this moment? There's one phrase that sort of sticks out to me. Now they are satisfied that we are in bitter slavery, but they've covenanted with their idols. Yeah, Bob, and then we'll pass it back to Arda for the second half of the prayer. Bob, did you want to say something?
I don't remember ever seeing anywhere where we abused ourselves to show anything like she is doing to herself. Even when God punishes people, it's like all at once, like turn into a pillar of salt, zap, or a flood, but nothing where people actually covered themselves in dung. This is over the top. It is definitely over the top, but there are traditions of Jews being aesthetics like this. Yeah, it does seem over the top, but as Eric alluded to, that does say that they cover itself with ashes, right? So yeah, this takes it to the extreme. Yeah. And I don't remember that kind of extreme before.
Yeah, well, again, right, this didn't make it into authentic, accepted Jewish text. It's not, this is from by the way, this is from the time of the Talmud, but again, the rabbis of the Talmud didn't include these things, right? So for them, it was too much. It was too out there, 2,000 years ago to include, but these variants still exist. These are variant texts that still exist, that were written by Jews, but the Christians accepted into their tradition. We never fully accepted this into our tradition. Arda, I'm going to put it back to you. Oh, okay. Lord.
Oh, Lord, do not surrender your scepter to what has no being, and do not let them laugh at our downfall, but turn their plea against them and make an example of him who began this against us, of our affliction, and give me courage. O King of the gods and master of all dominion, put eloquent speech in my mouth before the lion, and turn his heart to hate the man who is fighting against us, so there may be an end of him and those who agree with him. But save us by your hand and help me, who am alone and have no helper but you, O Lord. You have knowledge of all things, and you know that I hate the splendor of the wicked and abhor the bed of the uncircumcised, of any alien.
Okay, I'm just going to pause you for a second. Lots of interesting things here too, by the way, right? Like circumcision appears, circumcision versus uncircumcised appears here, right? There's this, now she's saying, right, she abhors the relationship that she's in, right? And, to me, the most important phrase, give me courage, right? As she's about to approach the king, right? Put eloquent speech in my mouth before the lion, right? And this is how Achashverosh is being, right? Turn his heart to hate the man who's fighting against us, right? So she's really like pouring on in her prayer. Okay, keep going. You know my
necessity, that I abhor the sign of my proud position, which is upon my head on days when I appear in public. I abhor it like a filthy rag, and I do not wear it on the days when I am at leisure. And your servant has not eaten at Haman's table, and I have not honored the king's feast or drunk the wine of libations. Your servant has had no joy since the day that I was brought here until now, except in you, O Lord God of Abraham, O God whose might is over all. Hear the voice of the despairing and save us from the hands of evildoers, and save me from my fear.
All right, reactions?
What time of history was that written? And who was the oppressor at that time?
I think it's Roman. It could have been Greek, but I think it's Rome. It's either Greek or Roman. Yeah, so yeah, thank you, Ruth. I didn't say that, right? So this is now, these were Jews, they were understanding the story of Purim in context of living under probably Roman persecution. Thank you. That puts more context into it. I appreciate that, Ruth, right? Right. So, here it's a very different Esther than we know, right? Our Esther, at least until the whole bowing incident, you would think she seemed pretty happy with her position, right? Maybe?
This kind of portrays her as
We don't know. Yeah. Go ahead, Marvin.
This seems to portray her as guilt-ridden and weak, and not heroic at all. I mean, it's a complete opposite of.
It's a very different perspective. Yeah. Ruth, did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a very different Esther, right? Again, she's praying the same words, right? Basically, Adonai Eloheinu, Elohe Abraham, right? This same sort of classic phrase. Really she's asking for strength in order to approach the king. I just sort of close out with, we had in the Talmud, the rabbis see the angels sort of working behind the scenes, but I'm going to give you the apocryphal version of how they have. Okay, let me just. Sorry, I got a lot of pages out here. Let me just get the right page that I want. Okay, yeah, here she actually faints as she sort of approaches. Her heart was frozen with fear. She was radiant with beauty. I'm sorry, I'm stealing your lines, Arda, but I'm just trying to finish up. Right? That approaching the king, she was terrified. She really got herself dolled up. Again, as Marvin said, a very different, not the strong Esther that we cherish and hold as our sort of heroine. Here it's, more weak. She had to sort of doll herself up for this moment. Right? Lifting the king's face, flushed with splendor, he looked at her in fierce anger, right? Whereas our version is the king was overcome with love for her, right? And just his feelings towards her. Here it's a very different story. The queen falters, turns pale, and faints, collapses on the head of the mate who went in front of her. Then God changed the spirit of the king to gentleness. In an alarm, he sprang from his throne, took her in his arms until she came to himself. He comforted her with soothing words and said to her, "What is it? I'm your husband. Take courage. You shall not die, for our law applies to all." He raised the golden scepter and touched her neck with it. He embraced her. It's a very different reading. God is involved. There is God here, right? God is the one who changes the heart. To me, it's very reminiscent of Pharaoh, right? With the hardened heart that then God changes, so it's a really interesting, very different reading. Any other comments, thoughts?
She could have fainted because she was hungry. She didn't eat for 3 days.
I'm starving and it's only been like 4 hours. I know. Yeah. Other comments, thoughts?
In the Megillah itself, wasn't there some hesitation that Esther had to actually go before the king? And Mordecai said, "You were put here just for this." So
Oh
there
yeah, a
was
lot of hesitation. Oh
a lot
yeah,
of hesitation, and this may try to embellish that what she actually was going through.
right. Her hesitation was just that she didn't have the koyach to do it, the self confidence. Is that what you're saying, Eric?
Yeah, that's what it says in Megillah. I think this is a way to interpret that, to say, well, she had to actually go through all these to get herself strong enough to actually do this.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to just bring to answer some of there are different classic questions about the Megillah, right? Why is God not mentioned, or and also why did Mordecai not bow, and just bring a couple different voices to the table. So I hope that you have an easy and meaningful fast. I can't wait to celebrate tonight. And really, the goal of the Megillah, or one of the best lines of the Megillah is that. Layodim Hayata Ora V'Simcha V'Sason. I don't know if I said that right, but yeah. Kain Tialanu V'Ikar. I forgot the V'Ikar. Right, that for the Jews there was light, there was gladness, there was honor, and so it should be for us. So I hope that in all of your celebrations and all of our celebration, there's light, there is joy, there is honor, and there is only good things. Thanks for learning with me. We're sorry we're taking next week off, but then we're going to do a Passover class in 2 weeks from today on the 20th. Okay?
Okay.